Welcome to Zooming In. I'm Berny Belvedere, senior editor of the UnPopulist. I'm joined today by Raymond Roberts, author of A Democratic and Republican Faith, a theologically serious and hopeful book that recovers what authentic Christian faith actually demands of its adherents, at precisely the moment when so much of American Christianity has lost the plot. Today, we discuss what a genuinely God-centered public theology looks like, why MAGA evangelicalism represents a profound departure from it, and what it might take to find our way back. We hope you enjoy.
Ray, I first met you at LibCon. We had a wonderful chat as the liberalism and religion breakout session was getting started. And it was really cool because it was an example of how events like that help connect liberals together to more effectively advance the cause. So here we are having a conversation about a wonderful book you just wrote, and might not have been possible had we not met at LibCon. So that was a really cool thing. I was happy to see you there. Hope you can make it this year.
Absolutely. The LibCon last year was excellent. Every program was excellent, inspiring. It was wonderful, good people to network with and be encouraged by. So I hope I see a lot of folks this year. I need to go back.
Yeah, hope to see you there for this year's. I want to start with Tocqueville. So Tocqueville makes an early appearance in your book, as he should, right? Tocqueville's a natural place to start on this topic. So what Tocqueville noticed when he visited America in the early 1800s was that its democracy was succeeding in a way that European watchers found utterly bewildering. And the explanation didn't turn out to be a purely constitutional one or a legal one. It crucially also involved a cultural component too. The churches were doing something, right? They were producing a specific kind of person, someone who can exhibit Republican sensibilities, someone who is imbued with a moral vocabulary, with a sense of civic duty, right? With a capacity for equality even. And you cite the term Tocqueville gave for this, which is a democratic and Republican faith. You do a great job of helping us see how far we've fallen from that ideal, right? So bringing it forward to our own day, you write, today, this heritage is at risk. Mainstream Protestant churches are in disarray. They have lost significant numbers of members, and the cultural resources they once helped replenish have eroded. Without these resources to help Americans work through their differences and lend legitimacy to Republican government and civil rights, democracy teeters. So in a second, I want you to walk me through why democracy is negatively impacted by Protestant churches being in disarray. I do want you to walk me through that. I think that's a very important point. But first, I want you to tell me why you chose that term, disarray. It was a deliberate choice. You considered other descriptors to capture the church's current state of being, but you landed on disarray. Now, political junkies will instantly recognize that from the Dems in disarray headline trope, right? But you're saying prots in disarray. I don't know. I went for symmetry there, but unfortunately, prots just isn't up to par, is it? Protestants in disarray is better. Or rather, closer to your argument, the Protestant churches are in disarray, right? I think that's the closest to your argument. And you're including evangelicals in that category of mainstream Protestants, right? What are those other terms that didn't get chosen, and why did you choose disarray as the most accurate descriptor?
One way to talk about what's happened is that there's a lot of discussion about the decline of mainline Protestantism. And I think that, the decline in members, in giving, in the number of churches, decline in the institutions as institutions have lost funding and closed. So there's been a decline. Another way it gets talked about is disestablishment. People, especially in the church, talk about, well, we're disestablished, we're outside looking in now. We used to own the culture. People who talk like I do sometimes get accused of pining for the old days. And my own sense is that the the Protestant church has been in a kind of disarray. It has not adapted well to changes in the culture, and some changes probably needed to happen, but we no longer have effective institutions that transmit the faith to the new generation. We're not keeping our kids. We no longer have effective institutions for communicating our ideas to others and solidifying sort of a conversational base. And it's a complicated story that about how we reached this point. But I think disarray is a more helpful way to talk about it, because it suggests that that we need to get our act together, and that we could get our act together. And if we were more effective at forming disciples, sharing our ideas, communicating with others, and communicating even with our own members, our ideas, I think that would go a long way towards it. Maybe not, it won't bring back the days of yore. I don't think that's possible, and probably not even desirable. But might help the church, the mainline church, which has historically been a keeper of democratic and Republican values. It might help us to be effective again in sharing those values in ways that bleed outside of the church into the broader culture.
You have these 3 Ds as possible explanatory diagnoses, right? And you just went through them. You have decline, disestablishment, and disarray. Disarray, it feels like it captures the true state of the church in its chaotic erosion. Like the others don't quite grasp the predicament the way that disarray does. Is that your thinking?
Yes, and I would say that disestablishment really does name the way the church, back in the 1950s, when there were just a few radio networks and early television networks. The networks were viewed as belonging to the people, not to the networks. And there was public service time that was demanded of the networks, and they gave a lot of that stuff to mainline churches in recognition of their status in society. And then what happened, I think, is that as that recognition declined, that the airways belonged to the public, the mainline church didn't want to pay for it. And in fact, the evangelicals who did, were often caught up in financial scandals and message deterioration, saying crazy things just to get an audience. And so, but the National Council of Churches used to have an office that was dedicated to public media. And then similarly, higher education, a lot of the colleges around the world were founded as by churches to spread their ideas. The idea being that, spreading our ideas in training future leaders of society is a good way for our ideas to penetrate into the culture. And over time, those institutions became more secular. Some of the particularities of the faith were marginalized in light of an emphasis on freedom and tolerance and those sorts of values, which were, and I would argue, are Christian values. And then in the mid-century, there was a great push by neo-Orthodox people, the likes of Reinhold Niebuhr, H. Richard Niebuhr, Paul Tillich, who in the Federal Council of Churches, National Council of Churches, started campus ministry programs, started journals and magazines designed to show the intersection of faith and areas of human study. These things were going pretty well until about 1968, when the churches began pulling the plugs on their campus ministries because the campus ministers opposed the Vietnam War and were supporting civil rights, and the church is not up for supporting that stuff. And it was a huge mistake, I think. And so the disengagement from higher education is strategically devastating, because that's a time when people are choosing their vocation. It's a time when they're deciding their place in the world. They're figuring out what they're called to do and to be, and what they're going to give their lives to. And for the church to just pull the plug on that stuff, it turned out exactly how you might expect, and so we need how to re-engage on those things.
So the framework that you're offering for potential diagnoses of the problem, we might say that the decline option, that one is the numbers narrative. So membership, money, aspects of the institutions themselves, these began hemorrhaging. Disestablishment, by contrast, locates the problem a little bit more externally. So maybe the media and communications infrastructure no longer privileged the mainline Protestantism's voice. And so let me pause there for a second, because before I get to Disarray, I think that was a really interesting word there, disestablishment. It was a soft disestablishment because they were never really established as the official church of the country. And we don't want to cede ground to the Christian nationalists and others who would make that affirmative claim. It's more like you are no longer privileged, and that has kind of eroded your social influence, or you haven't been able to recover that social influence very easily. And then Disarray locates the problem again internally, almost as if it's a decline narrative. But instead, here's what's interesting about the Disarray diagnosis. It's the kind of thing where the church can get its act together, and it's under its control to do so in a way that decline and disestablishment, those factors are largely out of its control. We, and by we, I mean me and yourself and Christians all over the country, we can't really do anything about whether membership goes down, or whether media venues no longer want to carry certain messages. But what we can do is self-correct and in certain important ways that would lead us out of disarray.
Yes, I think that's a good summary. It's sometimes discussed as cultural disestablishment. It's not formal legal.
I like that
establishment, but it is cultural. There's probably today there's not really a mainline thinker who holds the kind of status that, say, a Reinhold Niebuhr held at one point, or Martin Marty for years at the University of Chicago was somebody who was quoted continually. Stanley Hauerwas is probably the most recent person who has kind of been a mainline spokesman. His theology is really not mainline at all in a lot of ways. He's very much a pacifist, and he's a brilliant guy, and he's contrary and he's funny as all get out. But and I love Stanley, but I wouldn't call him representative of sort of the mainline project and historically understood. In fact, he's critical of it. He thinks the church just sold out. That's his take.
Let me stay on that theme for a second, because there are a lot of liberals who are irreligious. There are a lot of liberals who find religion to be a problem, at least in many manifestations that we see in society and around the world. And they might wonder, what's the big problem with the church being in disarray? What really is the negative consequence there? And I want to actually take a step back and answer that question. You have a small passage in your book, a short passage that I think is really meaty and helpful, but it is short because you kind of you make it in passing to move on to the next point. But I want to just sort of stop here for a second, because I think this most vividly captures what religion at its best can do for liberal society. So you provided a list of the Protestant church's achievements, if we can put it that way. And what's striking is that when you inventory what the church has accomplished over the 2 centuries following Tocqueville's visit, and I mainly have in mind here civic accomplishments, not, other kinds like artistic or whatever. The list is extraordinary in its breadth and ambition. So you brought up schools and colleges. Protestant denominations founded hundreds of institutions of higher ed across the country, right? And not as a luxury or as an afterthought, but as a deliberate strategy of civic formation. The idea was that training leaders for church and society was among the most effective ways that you can embed democratic values in the culture. They also developed publishing houses. Denominations invested heavily in producing materials, and not just spiritual materials, devotional content, right? but also ones that had a civic application. This was the information ecosystem of its era, and mainstream Protestants were major players in it. The abolitionist movement is another legacy. It drew on Protestant moral resources, the conviction that every human being bears the imago Dei, the image of God, and that no political configuration can sanction the treating of another human being as mere property. Churches and church networks, in an extended sense, they provided the infrastructure, the platforms, the speakers, even safe houses for some of this stuff. You mentioned missions to the unhoused and children's homes for at-risk kids. There's prison reform movements. There's settlement houses for immigrants. As waves of immigrants arrived in America, Protestant affiliated entities provided settlement houses, right? And that included educational components too. Peace conferences, the civil rights movement. That's perhaps the least one that needs any elaboration. We all know what it was. We know how it's indebted to Protestant theology. There Black Protestant churches were the sites where this stuff got dreamed up. If these are the things you have in mind that the mainstream Protestant churches in America helped deliver, and if that is no longer a significant source of reformist energy we can count on, then that is indeed a very big loss. The rest of your book kind of goes along on grappling with that. That's what the book's about. Can you give me a kind of big picture of what's our way out of this mess? Because as I went through that list, I want more of those things. I want those good social outcomes. How do we get religion kind of supplying that animating impulse?
I think the church is going to have to be intentional about seeking to revitalize itself. It can't just assume that we'll coast along. We're going to have to invite people to take a theocentric perspective. We're going to have to invite people to respect the dignity of other human beings. And this is in concrete ways. I mean, we just saw in New Jersey just the other day, people protesting the conditions under which immigrants are being kept. And the reason we should care about that is because they bear the image of God. And if we believe that, we'll have to speak up. I keep repeating the word invitation because I do think there's a chance here that there's a course correction we could be making. I mean, in some ways, the evangelicals sort of made that course correction when they realized how disestablished they were back in the 60s and 70s. And they built institutions for sharing their ideas. They built Liberty University in the 70s. They understood that they needed to train people and that they needed to reach people. I think for a long time, the mainline church has thought that if we speak truth to power, we have done the work. And that's not enough. We have to speak truth to people in a way that they find compelling. And it's in that formation of a thick theological vision that is lived out in concrete ways, like you're talking about the abolition movement, the progressive movement of the turn of the century, the social gospel movement. I don't think most Protestants know the history that we have here. And it wasn't just Protestants, the Catholics also, Rerum Novarum, Labor Extends, there's a Catholic social tradition here as well. The work that the mainline church did around the just and durable peace conferences in the 1930s, because they could see the world was headed to war and they wanted to figure out how to make it better. And that was critical for the reconstruction after World War II. And we're seeing today that those institutions are fraying and falling apart. That order is gone. But the church has to be theologically intentional. This is where I think Stanley Hauerwas is right. The church has taken for granted its own identity. It's kind of almost assumed that to be a faithful person is to be a good American. And in some ways, I affirm that in the book. But I think that's not going to be enough. You don't need to go to church. You don't need to listen to sermons. You don't need to study the Bible. You don't need to enter in conversation with people you disagree with in a Sunday school class and hash things out. If all you need to do is to be a good American, there's something more that we're called to be. And that is, for Christians, it's called to be people of faith, followers of Christ. And we have to be way more intentional about that than we have been. And we can't just, what I saw when I was a pastor in New Jersey is that I think a lot of folks, when their kids are in high school, they think, I want my kids to be good kids. That's why they're involved in sports on Sunday morning. And it was hard for the church to compete with that because the sense of identity had been so merged with the culture. And the church needs to maybe once again claim that, yes, we have a distinct vision. Our vision, this is where natural law comes in my book, doesn't mean that everybody else is wrong or we can't learn from anybody else, or that we like the Christian nationalists, we have to control everything. It means that we can work with others, but we've got to recover that sense, that theological sense of who we are. And it's a generous sense. I think historically, the best of it has been generous.
Yeah, and you introduce a really helpful distinction that I want to briefly lay out in a second, that I think helps us find a way out of this, or at least understand what the church must at least minimally be in order to retain its strong presence without eroding or becoming a shell of itself, or becoming absorbed into the larger culture. And that distinction is the one that is it the Michael Walzer who makes when he distinguishes between thick and thin moral reasoning. And I'll come to that in a second. I just want to stay with Tocqueville for one more question. You quote John Adams in the book, and he's got this famous or infamous, however you want to look at it, statement, right? Our Constitution is designed only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for any other. One of Tocqueville's insights, though, was that religion isn't always democratically beneficial. In France, he saw religion and the free society almost always pushing against each other. Tocqueville did like what he saw in 19th century American, early 19th century America. But if he were to run his analysis today, what would he conclude about the forms of religious expression present in American Christianity today?
That's a very good question. I think he made a distinction between democratic and Republican religion and undemocratic religion. And as you say, in France, he saw that the priests were allied with the aristocracy and were not in tune with the movement towards freedom. In the South, he was critical of slave owners. And throughout history, we see forces of illiberal religion at work. It's never simply religion's good or bad. You've got to go, religion's always held by particular people at particular times, and it's what they believed and what they did with it in the times that they lived, and they sometimes were chafing against each other. The abolition movement had other people who argued against abolition. The social gospel had folks who claimed that the people who are wanting to install sewer systems and other improvements, labor laws, and that sort of thing. They had forsaken the gospel, which is only about saving people from hell. Then when the church was supportive of eliminating prayer in school from public schools, official formal prayer from public schools, they were always accused by illiberal religionists of forsaking the gospel. I think what we have seen maybe for the first time in a while is that illiberal forms of religion are ascendant in our culture, and they are recognized by, say, the Secretary of Defense in ways. He brings a person to speak to a group of folks, and the person is the person who wants to get rid of women's right to vote. We haven't seen that for a while. The Christian nationalists have gotten a hearing, and things that used to be rather fringe have moved to the mainstream. And I think we have to be able to speak out about that.
Sometimes there's nuance here that we just need to make sure that we get across, as you do in the book. So you mentioned just now the social gospel, and you invoked that earlier in that list of achievements that the church has been able to help propel. And it remains controversial, though, among Christians of a more conservative or evangelical bent. I think on this one, there's sort of like a both sides problem. There are formulations of the social gospel I personally find wrongheaded. But the idea, I think, in its good form is straightforward. So the gospel that is, with no social qualifier before it, the evangelion or good news, the central teaching of Christianity. Christ died for our sins, freely offers redemption to anyone who wants it, and that's the path forward to reconciling with God. Our sin puts us at alienation from God. He's bridged that gap through his sacrifice. We claim it by simply believing in him. And when the social descriptor comes in, it can reconceive Christianity as, first and foremost, an instrument for positive social change. And of course, there's nothing wrong with positive social change. In fact, there's everything right with positive social change. But the Christian faith at its core is a revealed religion. It makes grand metaphysical claims. It has doctrines. It has propositional content that is foundational to its reform efforts. It's not incidental to those reform efforts. That's the thing. That's the thing that I think you're doing a good job in the book of pointing out, how you can have all these reform goals and ideas, but if they're not powered by a kind of genuine theological core, it's going to eventually kind of wither into, why don't I just keep the helping out society bit without going to all these meetings on Sundays and having all these extra obligations if it's just the same sort of output, right? So there has to be something different to it. It has to be powered by a different set of beliefs. So I'd say that the quote social gospel fails as an alternative to the gospel proper, because it's never meant to replace it properly, or it shouldn't. But it is supposed to be the natural outgrowth of someone who is genuinely impacted by the traditional gospel, right? Right? Like, so as the book of James puts it, faith without works is dead. And as a Christian, if you're not wanting the church to positively impact society, if these achievements we've been documenting don't seem to you to be an important impact that the Christian church can have, then you might be falling afoul of James' diagnosis, I think, in that book, in the Bible. And I think a lot of churches today are. I think that's a good way to sort of show why it's not enough just to have a moral vision for society, or at least interest in certain reform efforts, for the church to retain its distinct character. It has to be backfilled by theological tenets that do that kind of inspiring work for those reform efforts.
I would add to that I think the social gospel people like Walter Rauschenbusch and those sorts of folks, Washington Gladden and others, I think that they were writing in a time where they could assume a lot of things, like that Christianity was more central to our culture, for example, and that people were familiar with the Bible. They were familiar. Everyone had one, everyone read one, and then the people who were heirs of that tradition kind of continued to operate like they did without really understanding that the thick religious practices and spiritual practices that make a faith compelling and sensing the glory of God and the beauty of God, and a sense of awe and a sense of gratitude, that thick piece of it is all part of the gospel, inspired by the sense of this overwhelming love that's made manifest to us. Those pieces, then it becomes like, well, we're going to do goodism, right? We're just going to be, it becomes partisan, and very often. And sometimes when I'm with some folks who are more progressive Christians who don't want to talk about the theology part, sometimes it comes across as do-goodism.
Right. Or at best, it just becomes like any other kind of reform effort where, like you were mentioning, the Christianity layer of it becomes epiphenomenal. Why even include this? I'm just getting together and feeding the unhoused with other people. Why do I need this other? So it needs to have a distinctive theological core, and to emphasize it, and to not hide from it, but to embrace it in a way that is, consistent with the biblical record and the tradition, and also with what it means to be a contributing member of society and all the rest of it. It's got to be normal at all the right points, but it has to be something that doesn't obscure its propositional theological content, but instead is anchored in that. I think that's the answer that a lot of theorists have said. It can't help but be that, or you get a watered down church that won't end up lasting. It just simply cannot last as a kind of add-on that you don't really need, because you sense that and then you dispense with it, and you just do the reform efforts without it. You actually introduce a set of theological principles that I want to get to. You think these can do the work of maybe civic renewal that Tocqueville's democratic and republican faith would ask of us, or that once did. You have 9 of them. I'm going to list them, but I don't want to go deep on all of them. You have theocentrism, creation, imago Dei, natural law, sin, hope, vocation, covenant, and ecclesiology. And that's the set of categories you might find in a systematic theology book. So this is theologically weighty stuff. Tell me, how can these realize the Tocquevillian vision today, you think?
That's a great question. I think maybe I should back up and say that Max Stackhouse, who was a professor of ethics, Christian ethics at Princeton, wrote a book called Public Theology, Political Economy, and he lists 10 theological themes or principles. And it's a brief chapter, and when I read it, I thought, I wish he'd say a lot more about this. And when I came up with my own list of 9, the purpose of the list is to try to flesh out in a deeper way for laity in particular. Here's some theological principles and their practical implications. Different traditions sometimes talk about these principles differently. They might, if I talk about natural law, a Roman Catholic probably would jump right to Aquinas on that. And it might be more assumed than it is in the Protestant circles, especially after late 20th century theology kind of dumped natural law. But the idea of natural law is there at the founding of the country, and was carried forward by all the Puritans. And James Wilson, the founder of University of Pennsylvania Law School, was inspired by what I would call Reformed Puritan natural law ideas in his lectures on law, which happened very early in the time of the Republic, reflect that.
So how can these kind of help us realize that Tocquevillian vision of a democratic and republican faith, basically a Christianity that is robust enough to continue existing and continue being influential, but also being very liberal friendly, being the kind of thing that activates the best parts of the scriptures and the tradition when it comes to how we view each other, how we interact with each other, how we live with each other, how we treat each other, right?
These principles are they float in our culture. Even the one I think is maybe most lost is the idea of covenant. I think we're very unfamiliar with that, but it's a part of our language. And
how would you contrast that with contract, for example?
Contracts are transactional. I will do this, you will do that, and that you enter contracts for what you get out of it. Covenants are recognition of the binding of our lives together. So you think of a couple, who are getting married, or you think of citizens taking a naturalization oath. Those things, your lives are bound together in ways, for good and for ill, is the idea. And so we're in this together now. And in a contract, you don't perform, the contract's over. And with covenants, there's a recognition that your life is bound to this other person, and it calls that into question. That's why the church has been reluctant sometimes to recognize divorce, and probably should be more affirming that in bad relationships, that you may still be bound together, but you're not really living out the inner heart of the relationship, which is the heart of love.
So one thing I keep coming back to when I read your treatment of one of those, which I think is maybe, I don't know if it's the most important, but one that you signal as really important, theocentrism. I keep coming back to Tim Keller, the author and Presbyterian pastor who recently passed away. So Keller, drawing on Calvin's observation in the Institutes of Christian Religion, one of the most famous works of theology in the Protestant history, Calvin's observation that the human heart is sort of relentlessly idolatrous. It's essentially an idol factory, right? And Keller spent much of his ministry making the kind of pastoral or spiritual version of that case. That idolatry isn't only about like literal statues. At its core, it's about taking any good thing and making it an ultimate thing. So whether that's career, family, romance, success, whatever you want to fill in that slot. Now, many irreligious liberals will disagree with the diagnosis here, and understandably so. But Keller's argument was that when you take a good thing and make it the ultimate thing, the good thing can become a destructive thing if it isn't God, because it can't bear the weight you've placed on it. It can't fill the role you've designated it. I think your framework is extremely complementary to that, but kind of like on a more civic wavelength than the pastoral one, right? So, for example, MAGA Christianity on this, let's call it Keller Roberts reading. It isn't just a political phenomenon. It's a kind of collective or national idolatry. But in this case, it's not work, so your vocation or family or whatever else. It's instead nation, leader, even the idea of MAGA, right? The cultural restoration piece of it, that's been placed by some of these MAGA Christians where God belongs in their lives. And what follows is exactly what both you and Keller predict. You get moral blindness. You get a kind of ferocity toward outsiders. You get there's a willingness to excuse anything done in the service of the cause, because again, this is a political phenomenon now. Does that framing resonate with how you're thinking about theocentrism? Do you think it applies, in this way? And does it apply, with equal force across the ideological divide? Or is there something distinctive about the particular idolatries of this particular moment?
Well, I think there's two things you can say about idolatry. One is that it has practical ethical implications. When we put other centers of value before God, the way we value the other things in our value field changes. The New Orleans Saints had this bounty thing where if they injured a player on the field, they give them a bounty. Well, if your center of value is winning and your center of value is your team, other people become expendable. You can sacrifice them. What's tricky about idolatry is when it picks up religious symbols, as in Christian nationalism right now. Then I think it's harder for people to sort out what's going on. And but what's really going on, I think, with Christian nationalism is like you say, it's the worship of the nation. There was a portrait of Trump healing somebody, and in the picture there were, there was the dove coming down, I believe, and there were jets, and all these. The symbols get used interchangeably: the cross and the flag and the Bible and and military hardware and all that stuff just kind of is blended together. And when you can't tell when that happens, that's a clue that there is a form of idolatry or syncretism that is taking place, and inevitably we will not every human values things. That's part of. In fact, that's something I tried to deal with in every chapter, is that each of these doctrines addresses some aspect of human being, whether it's valuing or forming relationships or is there a right or wrong. There's some fundamental human question that these doctrines answer. They get answered in different ways by different traditions, but everyone has to struggle with this, even non-religious people. They have to figure out how to value things. And idolatry is a way of talking about what we value and how we value it, and asks whether we're valuing it correctly.
Right. And let me ask about one of those doctrines. I found your treatment of sin really worthwhile. And I want to make sure listeners understand what I mean, because sin is one of those words that can sound like it's only about personal morality or individual failing. But your argument is that a robust doctrine of sin is actually one of democracy's best friends. So if you genuinely believe that human beings are chronically prone to self-deception, self-interest, the abuse of power, all the rest of it, then checks and balances, these aren't mere suggestions. These aren't even just inconveniences. They're absolute moral necessities. And I think, so the founders understood this intuitively. And then they understood it explicitly, and they designed a constitution that, assumed the worst about human beings and human nature, even while sort of hoping for the best. I think that's right. Uh, all of the liberal valuing of limited government and constitutional checks on power and all the rest of it, that flows from it. One of the most striking features of the current authoritarian moment, though, is a kind of demand for trust. You got to trust the leader, trust the movement, trust that the power won't be abused if it's in the right hands. A serious doctrine of sin is a direct theological rebuttal, to put it one way, to that demand. Do you think that's a case that can land with people who don't share our theological vocabulary? Like, does sin play in a non-theological context too?
I hope so. I mean, you've got people like Thomas Paine, who wrote Common Sense, and he was not an Orthodox believer by any stretch of the imagination. But he notes that republics are less likely to go to war than monarchies. I do think that our conception of sin is eroded, even in the church. I don't think we have a strong, robust understanding of sin. I think for a while, sin became identified with peccadillos, and rather than seeing that this is the chronic human failure, and it happens over and over and over, and its results are always bad. And it's not just about individuals; it's also about groups. Groups are also sinful. And at this moment, there's a reason. I think the founders said that that the legislative branch, which is more accountable to the people, should determine how to raise revenue and how to spend, and that they should declare war, not the executive branch. And it seems to me that we need to recover, and I hope we can recover an understanding of the chronic human fault. Because if we can't, I don't see how we move back to a place where the republic's on firmer ground. We need to say, hey, we've made a wrong turn here. And we're now seeing the consequences of what happens when one person makes a decision about war, and the wisdom of the group is not allowed to weigh in. And I think if the wisdom of the group had been consulted, if there'd been a case made to the people, it doesn't mean that we'll always get it right. Groups also make mistakes and are prone to sin, but there's the possibility, a greater possibility, that a better path will be found.
In the book, you distinguish between knowledge and wisdom. I mean, all of us distinguish between the two in our most clear-eyed moments, but I wondered if you could unpack that distinction a bit in terms of how you understand the two.
So I think of knowledge as like, the things we know about the world, and it's not unrelated to wisdom, right? Knowledge is knowing the price of everything. Wisdom is knowing its true value. Wisdom is knowing that you depend upon others and that others depend upon you. You see yourself in relationship with others. Wisdom is that deeper level of perspective on oneself and on others. Wisdom is knowing that it's not a smart idea to give one person too much power. That's wisdom, because people are prone to corruption.
Given that many Protestant churches, denominations, affiliated organizations, they're among the most depleted or defeated, where do they draw the resources for institutional regeneration and renewal? Is it purely a leaning into our scriptural tradition? Is it more a let's see in a sort of pragmatic way what works as effective forms of communication, and we kind of just jostle against other groups for attention? What's going to propel these Protestant denominations and churches to be able to play a bigger role in society once again for the benefit of all, as the argument goes?
I think there's a great deal of discouragement in the mainline and mainstream Protestant churches right now. It's hard work. We don't have institutions to spread our ideas that are very effective. There are some, but they're not terribly. They don't have broad reach or deep reach into the culture. And so what happens is that a lot of people come to church on Sunday, and then they go and they watch, either Fox or, MSNBC during the week, and they're which group gets to form the people? Well, it might not be the 1 hour in the pew on Sunday. And but I think the source of encouragement has to be God. The idea that God is truly the glory that lasts. Maybe this republic has reached the end of its rope. I hope not. I don't think it has. But no republic lasted forever. I'm giving you a paper this weekend on the founders and the principles that guided the founders. And one of the principles I'm not going to be talking about, that I wish I had enough time to talk about, is the idea of providence. That they had a sense of providence, and things didn't always go well in the war, but that's kind of what carried them through. And this was their sense of hope. Providence was how they talked about a sense of hope. That even in the midst of seeing and being discouraged, there is a sense of hope. And in every movement that has moved forward in this country, whether it's abolitionists or whether it's the civil rights movement, has been inspired by a theological sense that, I may not see it, I may not get to the mountaintop with you, but we will see it.
And that authentic form of Christian hope, as opposed to its fake alternatives, is one that can take on that work without kind of collapsing or falling back into a siege mentality. That's the key thing. You can have a belief that things aren't right and that things need to be put right, and you can have hope without it leading to, all the pathologies that we've seen, and that authentic Christian hope that is inviting and hospitable and kind in the face of harm, and decent, and doesn't violate its principles, and it stands true to what it believes, and it treats people with dignity and honor. That's authentic Christian hope, when you maintain hope with that kind of register.
That chapter on hope was the one that took me the longest to kind of put together. It was originally going to be called Liberation. And in talking with my dissertation advisor, I said, why are you calling it that? Well, I called it that because that's what Max called his paragraph on that. But then I thought about it, and I thought, well, maybe it's redemption. And in a way, I'm talking about redemption, but I am talking about redemption. But what every other chapter had been rooted in a fundamental human question. And finally, it occurred to me the fundamental human question is about hope. And everybody has some way of putting together an attitude towards the possibilities of history. And that took me longer to put together than any of them, I think, because what is the fundamental human question? And it is, must things always be this way? Can there be change? And the answer to that question, I think, especially for believers, is yes. For Christians, that they can be different. Are you going to have the kingdom tomorrow? No, that we know. Yeah. But we can. God is still at work as a redeeming presence, and in the end, it's God's glory, and that's enough to get us to tomorrow.
Raymond Roberts, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me on. It's been a deep pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Zooming In, a project of the UnPopulist. To get all of the updates from our new series, Executive Watch, make sure to subscribe for free at theunpopulist.net. Until next time.